Last time, we looked at the end of Exodus 23, and there is the promise of God's presence in Exodus 23, and this chapter is also about God's presence. In chapter 23, I would say God's presence is related to his protection, his driving out the enemies of Israel as they entered the land. Here the promise is related to worship and covenant, and the two are related. Moses, who is the mediator of God's covenant, is given even greater access, a greater sense of God's presence. It's interesting, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul speaks, he writes it in the third person. I knew a man who was caught up to the third heaven, but commentators have suggested Paul is speaking of his own experience there. Paul was given a heavenly, or a taste of heavenly glory. Now, another interesting way as we think of this chapter is to think of different degrees of what we call holiness, degrees of holiness. This goes all the way to the garden. You have, in Genesis 2, you have the world, then you have Eden, and you have the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is where God's special presence would be known. Eden is a larger area, and then you have the rest of the world. When the tabernacle or the temple are later constructed, you have the outer court. The priests could go into the holy